Hi, I'm Kevin Schulman. I'm a professor of medicine here at Duke University Medical Center. I specialize in internal medicine. PCSK9 inhibitors are a new class of medicines that have been brought to market to reduce high blood cholesterol for people with familial hypercholesterolemia, but also for people who actually, their physicians don't think that they have sufficient LDL lowering. These two drugs are both approved by FDA this summer, Repatha and Praluent. So these drugs seem to be very potent in terms of their ability to reduce LDL cholesterol. Two papers in the New England Journal of Medicine, randomized controlled trials, showed that patients on these medicines actually had a reduction in LDL cholesterol from 120 milligrams per deciliter at baseline to roughly 60 milligrams per deciliter when they're on therapy. That's a very interesting question. So the design of these clinical trials was really around LDL reduction. In post-hoc analysis, they've looked to see whether or not there's any reduction in cardiovascular events. And what they found was actually in these post-hoc analyses, about a 50% reduction in cardiovascular events. But we have to realize that the population that they studied had a very low rate of events in the duration of the clinical trial, roughly 2 to 3% annual cardiovascular event rates, and we saw about in this post-hoc analysis about a 50% reduction. So the moral of the story is very low event rates in the population treated in the clinical trial, some reduction, and we didn't go to zero in the clinical trial. And again, these are post-hoc analysis. We're still waiting for the long-term outcome studies to see whether or not there's a sustained benefit in terms of reduction in cardiovascular events. So we've been looking at LDL cholesterol reduction for a long time, since actually the early days of the statins. And there's been recurring controversy about the relationship between LDL reduction and reduction in cardiovascular events. Almost calls into question the relationship between LDL and cardiovascular events in the first place. So there's no question from Framingham that patients with very high levels of LDL cholesterol were the ones at highest risk over time for cardiovascular events. Now that we're at these, with statin therapy with patients at these very low levels, the question is whether or not there's an absolute threshold or any dose-response relationship between LDL reduction lowering and reduction in cardiovascular events. The American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association, actually a couple of years ago, dropped LDL goals in terms of therapy and just said we should have our patients on a statin. We'll have to see if they go back and revisit those recommendations after the outcome studies are released from these new class of medicines. So what's interesting and why we wrote this paper about this class of medicines was this whole idea of specialty pharmaceutical products targeted at a population of patients with high blood cholesterol. If you think back 20 years ago, actually the beginning of my career was looking at statin therapy, and people were worried about the cost of statin therapy when these were brand name molecules that were going to cost several $100s a year. These PCSK9 inhibitors are biologics and injectables, and what's really striking is the price point. The list price on these molecules is over $14,000 per patient per year, presumably for the rest of their life. That's the first time we've seen a price point this high in the cardiovascular market, and especially thinking about a price point or especially pharmaceutical product from the perspective of a preventive therapy, either primary prevention or secondary prevention, depending on the indication. This is a tremendous amount of money to reduce long-term sequelae of high blood cholesterol or progression of cardiovascular disease. And so to look at this question, we tried to put this into context. There are a couple of different ways you could look at this. So what would be the cost effectiveness of this therapy? We didn't do that analysis because we really don't know the outcome results yet. But in our analysis, we said, well, what happens if they just reduce all cardiovascular events? Again, there were very low levels of cardiovascular events in the treatment population in the clinical trials, so we just eliminated them. we went from 3% down to 0, and that ended up with an average cost saving per patient of only $600 a year. And this relates to the number needed to treat. Obviously, if we're treating 100 people to get 3 to reduce the cardiovascular events, we're not going to have a huge amount of economic benefit. So then we looked further and said, well, let's take a step back. How are we, or how is the sponsor thinking about funding this therapy? And this is the whole question surrounding specialty pharmaceutical products and products that are this expensive. Obviously, $14,000 for a median income in the family in the United States of $68,000 a year would be a tremendous amount of money out of pocket. And so most likely we're going to have this, if it's going to be funded, it'll be through health insurance. And so patients who benefit from this therapy could get access to it. But where's the money coming from? I'm lecturing right now with our second-year medical students here at Duke, and we actually have a proverbial pot in the middle of the lecture hall. And I said, well, imagine your health insurance premiums go into this pot, and then as we have a benefit that we want to pay for with our insurance premiums, we take money out of the pot. And so what would happen if we add PCSK9 inhibitors to the benefit package? Well, about 27% of the population, adult population in the United States, has elevated high blood cholesterol. Not all of those people meet indications for PCSK9 inhibitors, but we assumed roughly maybe 5% would, based on the current label. Remember, these are people that could be statin intolerant and didn't have maximal reduction in LDL therapy according to their physician. So at the end of the day, that's almost 1 million people in the United States that could stand to benefit from this therapy. At $14,000 a person, when we calculate that all in, that ends up being about $124 increase in our health insurance premiums for everyone in the insurance pool. Now, that's only on the private health insurance side. We also didn't estimate the cost, but we have to remember that we're also, if you're employed, you're also paying taxes to pay for the Medicare Part D benefit for seniors who are on Medicare, and presumably some of those people will also be on PCSK9 inhibitors. So the economic implications of this are an increase in insurance premiums for everybody who's paying for other people to have access to this therapy. In addition, potential increases in taxes or deficits down the road to pay for the cost burden on the Medicare program as well. Nowhere in our analysis did we suggest that these medicines can be paid for by a reduction in cardiovascular events, at least from the data that we've seen.